Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our seminar series. It's a pleasure for me to introduce today's speaker, who is Melissa Lane. Melissa is the class of 1943 professor of politics. She's also the director of the University Center for Human Values, and she actually has a number of links into PEI. All of them have been remarkably helpful and productive. She is co-convener of the Climate Futures Initiative, which we currently, meaning PEI and the Center for Human Values, currently sponsor together. She's also one of the instructors in our new main undergraduate course, ENV 200, the Environmental Nexus. In fact, we have a terrific working relationship with the Center for Human Values, in large part due to Melissa's interest in the environment. Some of you may know her as the author of the book called Eco-Republic, which came out in 2012 and about which she has spoken to a group within PEI earlier. She has received many honors and awards, including a number of named lectureships at various prestigious universities. The next one is the 2018 Carlisle Lecturer at Oxford University. And as you can tell from her title, her research interests include links between Greek political theory and modern-day political debates with a focus on environmental issues. So please join me in welcoming Melissa.
Thank you so much, Mike, and I'd also like to thank Francois Morel, who invited me to speak as one of his last acts, I think, as director last year of the Institute, and it's been wonderful to work with him and now with Mike and with all the staff in PEI, whom I know well from the Environmental Nexus course and other reasons. So this talk is exploring ancient ideas of politics in Greek antiquity and in biblical antiquity as they mediate between ecology and theology. So in 1968, Stuart Brand, the founder of the Whole Earth Catalog, asserted, speaking of the human relation to the environment, we are as gods, and he said we'd better get good at it. And of course, that idea has been very much taken up in the further development of the idea of the Anthropocene, that distributed human agency has made humans an ecological, indeed a geological force. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a few moments. But I want to begin by saying the fact that human agency may, as it were, as if we were gods, have brought about the Anthropocene doesn't mean that a reverse intervention of a quasi-omnipotent and benevolent kind is as readily within our current agential capacities. So when I think of what it means to say we are as gods, I think we shouldn't think of the typical monotheistic image of God. We should think we might turn out to be more like the Greek gods, rivalrous, quarrelsome, and sometimes ultimately hapless. So we can bring things about like the Trojan War, but we can't necessarily stop them from going wrong. We may be unable to control or reverse some of the effects of our actions. So as I suggested, Brand's assertion is often taken to herald a major novelty in humans' relation to the environment. Previously, we were not as gods, but now we are. And of course, scientists and historians have been debating, to what do we index the now? Is this the Industrial Revolution, or have human interventions had major effects on the biosphere, perhaps even in bringing about the fifth extinction, as well as now portending the sixth? But I think that while this way of thinking, the notion of the Anthropocene is obviously relatively new, the idea that the relationships between humans, gods, and nature is important for the human relationship to the environment is much older. And of course, it flourished in what's known as the axial age of the synchronic emergence of multiple great civilizations. And so what I want to do today is to explore three main themes. First of all, labor and agriculture and spontaneity or effort in producing food for both the Greeks and the Hebrews. Secondly, divine rule, human rule, and nature. And then thirdly, divine rule, human rule, and in particular, the condition of the land. So those are going to be the three main themes that I explore. Now, of course, the role of antiquity, both pagan and monotheistic, in framing these issues has long been a subject of discussion. And more than 50 years ago, the distinguished medieval historian, Lynn White Jr., the father of one of our recent colleagues in the politics department, gave a lecture, Lynn White Sr., in fact, and then Lynn White Jr. is our colleague, gave a lecture on the historical roots of our ecological crisis that offered one of the earliest grand narratives of the relationship between ecology and theology. And this lecture is generally remembered as a key intervention criticizing a certain role of what White called Judeo-Christian teleology. So White took it that Jewish and Christian thought was responsible in large measure for the overly controlling, interventionist, and ultimately technocratic picture of our human relation to the environment. And he ended his essay by urging a return to the alternative Christian path that was charted by St. Francis of Assisi, whose entertaining of the idea of animal souls had been lost in subsequent Christian theology. But what interests me, and really the starting point for this paper, was a neglected part of White's narrative, and that is the role of politics in his account. So White actually wrote that the fusion of science and technology was primarily achieved by the advance of modern democracy. And notwithstanding these deep roots in Judeo-Christian thinking that he was largely tracing, at one point in the essay he said, "Our ecologic crisis is the product of an emerging, entirely novel, democratic culture." And so as an historian of political thought, that was the bit that I seized on, because I thought, well, what's the role of politics? This is all about the human relationship to the gods and the way that we think about, what the gods have told us to do, to be stewards of the environment in a certain very controlling way. What's the role of democracy? And more broadly, what's the role of politics then in that story? And so that sent me back to the Jewish and Christian texts, and ultimately, of course, also to the Greek texts, to think about the role of politics in ancient environmental thought. So what I want to argue by taking these three particular topics to illustrate my claim is that politics was not just an adventitious or marginal dimension of ancient engagement with nature. It was actually really central, even in partnership and in conversation in different ways with ideas about the gods. Okay, so before I get to my main three claims then, or the main three areas I want to explore to develop this claim, let me just say a word more about the Anthropocene, because I think this will be more common territory to you all before we plunge into the biblical and Greek sources. So for historians, one of the most important works on the Anthropocene is a 2009 article by Deepesh Chakrabarty called The Climate of History, 4 Theses. And so there he rehearses the standard view that while humans have always been biological agents, it's only recently that we have become also geological agents in altering the chemistry of the atmosphere, and so the basic conditions of climate, sea levels, and ice. But what I started to think about was, well, let's see, is it true that in the past, before the Anthropocene, whenever we think that began, is it true that we were just biological agents, as it were, that our effect on the environment as sort of the earlier humans was just biological? And so I actually started to think about this in conversation with some work by our Princeton colleague Brent Shaw, a classicist, a Roman historian in classics. who had done some work on the disappearance of large mammalian fauna in Roman North Africa. And Shaw was in a debate with others about whether this was just a kind of just pure climate changes that led to this, or whether human biological practices, as he called it, biological agency, had had an impact in doing this. But what interested me was that what Shaw was focusing on was changing hunting practices. And of course, in other parts of classics, in the work of Pierre Vidal-Naquet and others, there's tremendous stress on the idea that hunting is, of course, a deeply culturally constructed practice. So it's not that when we say, oh, because humans hunted, they therefore destroyed the large mammalian fauna or had a role in that, that we can say, well, that's just a biological thing that early humans did, or Roman era humans did. It's rather that they did that as cultural and political agents. Their hunting practices were themselves markers of a kind of very well-developed cultural and political civilization, both for the Greeks and for the Romans. And so what that kind of suggested to me is, well, certainly when we're already talking about the axial age, so I'm not talking about kind of deep antiquity, but I'm talking about the 5th century, let's say, and beyond, before the Christian era, I want to say, well, any way in which humans are biological or environmental agents is always going to be mediated by politics and by culture. And so that's the claim that I then turn to my own sources, which are more the ancient Greek sources, and I have some limited expertise in relation to the Hebrew sources to think about. Okay, so my 3 areas, again, just to remind you then, are going to be first, food, secondly, human rule and divine rule and ecology, and thirdly, human rule, divine rule, and the land. And those second and third obviously bleed into each other. So first of all then, with food, I want to illustrate that both for the ancient Greeks and for the ancient Hebrews, there's this strikingly overlapping vision of an idyllic era in which we have a spontaneously self-renewing sustainability of nature for humans, and so an imagination of the absence of politics. Okay, so this first claim is really the sort of counterpoint to my claim. It's that actually politics always played a role, but humans, both the ancient Greeks and the ancient Hebrews, like to imagine that there might have been a kind of golden age, the Garden of Eden for the Hebrews, and what the Greeks knew as the age of Chronos, I'll say a bit more about that, which was a kind of imaginary age in which food was automatic and spontaneous, and therefore there was no need for politics. So this is the kind of fantasy that we could perhaps get away from politics in our relation to the environment. Okay, so in the first biblical account, so as you know, in the book of Genesis, or in Hebrew, Bereshit, there are actually 2 different accounts of the Garden of Eden and the creation of humans, and I'm going to touch on both of them. But in the first one, God creates vegetation, and here I'm reading from the Jewish Publication Society translation of the Hebrew, seed-bearing plants of every kind and trees of every kind bearing fruit with the seed in it. And after humans are created on the 6th day, these are presented to them as yours for food. And the thought is that in the Garden of Eden, humans can just pluck their food from the fruit trees. They don't need to do any work. There's no labor required in order to eat and to survive. And in a poem by Hesiod, who's one of the archaic, on the borderline of the archaic and the classical in ancient Greek thought, so he's slightly later probably, it's hard to say, than Homer, but we can think of him roughly contemporary. Hesiod in his poem Works and Days has a very similar image of this spontaneous generation of food. So he writes in lines 116 to 120, spontaneously then the earth bore rich abundant fruit, and these contented men living in peace enjoyed its works and all its many goods. Okay, so in this case, whereas in the Bible we just have Adam and eventually Eve in the Garden of Eden, for Hesiod we could actually have a whole human society that can be imagined in this age of Chronos. Chronos is the sort of master god of the universe before Zeus, so a pre-Olympian god. And this is imagined to be this moment of a kind of pure peace, abundance, and therefore lack of politics. So again, a spontaneously sustainable food supply can make politics unnecessary. And we get that same image again in two works of Plato, who also, in his works, The Statesman and the Laws, describes the age of Kronos, again, imagining it. And there's a wonderful word in the Greek here. Plato in The Statesman says, this means that humans may live without toil. And the Greek word is automaton, which is actually the word from which we get the word automaton. So it means automatically in that sense. There's no work, there's no effort, it's just spontaneously self-generating and self-renewing. And Plato then draws the specific implication that because the gods were making it possible for humans to live in such a way, quote, they had no political constitutions. So this is all an idea that this fantasy of spontaneity and abundance makes it unnecessary to have politics. And similarly, in Plato's Laws, we also have a rather different picture, actually, of what agriculture, the lack of the need for agriculture can mean. Okay, so where does it all go wrong? So these texts have this imaginary fantasy only in order to say, well, then how did we get to our actual era in which humans have to labor for food? And this is a key point for both the Greeks and the Hebrews to say you have to labor for food, and that brings with it the possibility of war, the need for politics, and everything else that follows. So in the second creation story in Genesis, the Bible injects human agriculture. So as punishment for the eating of the fruit, man is commanded to till and tend the garden. So they are still in the garden, but now they have to actually look after it. They have to work. And there's another line too that says you have to labor and bring forth through effort and toil, just as the woman is commanded that she will now have to labor to bear children. Now, some scholars have contrasted. It's actually very interesting what different scholars do with these biblical creation stories when they try to think about ecology and sustainability. So many people have said, oh, the stewardship kind of story in this second story, now we can give this a positive gloss. They're being stewards now, rather than just having the right to dominate all the other creatures that they had before. And that's often been the way. So often people have developed that as a kind of positive story. Yes, they now have to labor, but in laboring, they can steward the environment and sort of care for it. But Lynn White's view, as I've already suggested, was that no, this leads to a kind of further domination. When you're told that it's up to you to take care of it, that allows you to actually dominate and exploit it, and that's the direction he thought that subsequent Christian thought had largely gone. I also, years ago, when I was still teaching at the University of Cambridge, was very interested to hear a scholar of ancient Chinese thought, Anne Lonsdale, presenting on ancient thought and sustainability. And she was very critical of the stewardship model and contrasted it with what she thought was a much more positive model, which was the Taoist model of kind of letting be and wu wei. So it's interesting how people sort of take the valence of stewardship as a model for an ecology and sustainability. But what I want to stress is just the point that at this point, the dream of food without toil vanishes. And actually, I think this is kind of realistic that for the most part, even fruit trees need pruning if they're going to flourish long term. So, although I've also written elsewhere about Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau's idea of blackberry, where he still thinks that blackberrying is a kind of practice that allows us, he even compares it to the Garden of Eden. He says at one point in some unpublished late writings that were later published, he says it's like the Garden of Eden because we can feed ourselves and it's a kind of model, but he doesn't think we could just live on blackberries alone. right? So it's a kind of model, but not one that we can actually live by. So what we find then is that if humans now have to do agriculture, this opens the possibility, maybe there's a positive stewardship model, but there's also the possibility, of course, for destructive agricultural practices. And actually, it's very interesting that Plato, again, in one of his other dialogues, the Critias, comments on deforestation and soil erosion and the role of humans in contributing to that. So this is in the Critias, at 111c. He has said, well, there are some natural causes of erosion in archaic Attica, which is the land on which Athens develops. But then he says, but the Athenians cut down all these trees from the high mountains and they use those to build their houses. And now the soil is so diminished in quantity and quality that it, quote, can grow just barely enough for bees, right? So the thought is, once you have to start doing agriculture, that might lead you into these practices of deforestation. It can become destructive of the ecological balance. So the first point then is to say that I think many ancient civilizations, and even Thoreau and others even still today, have entertained this fantasy that humans could live in peace and without politics and political divisions if they could have a freely self-sustaining source of food. But that was a fantasy, and once that fantasy is relinquished, then destructive practices of agriculture, as well as maybe potentially productive ones, enter the picture. Okay, so now I want to move on to my second theme, and this is the relationship between divine rule, human rule, and nature. And what I want to explore here is, well, especially in the biblical accounts, where it would seem that we have this monotheistic God who's all-controlling and, all-powerful, is there then any room for politics in what happens between humans and nature? And the story that I want to illustrate this is the story of Pharaoh and the plagues. Okay? So what's the role for human agency and human politics in the kinds of punishments that we see visited in Exodus, in the book of Shemot, about the plagues? So this is a case which might seem the least hospitable in a way to such interplay, because it looks like a case where God is hardening Pharaoh's heart and punishing him, and God is sort of then completely controlling natural outcomes as a kind of sign of punishment for sin. Okay, so the traditional view of the plagues is that they just represent the divine will, kind of straightforward. So at one point, God says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart that I may multiply my signs and marvels in the land of Egypt. That's at Exodus 7:3. So then it looks like, of course, the plagues are going to fill the Nile with blood and cause fires and cause plagues of insects. So all these things that look to us like natural events, it looks like are being painted as just purely within God's control. God is just going to manipulate nature to punish humans, right? So it looks like there's no room for human agency, and there's not much room for kind of any notion of nature as sort of autonomous in any way. Now, one recent scholar in a collection that's just been published, in which I also have an article on food and the Bible, so she argues, Rachel Havrelak, that while we can think in a slightly different way about the idea of the plagues as what the Bible in Hebrew calls signs, otot, and she suggests perhaps the language of signs should be read as saying that levels of human consumption, or more broadly, we might think human activity, have a deleterious effect on the health and stability of our environment. So she says, let's think of the signs as sort of naturally occurring signs that signal something about what's happening in the environment, rather than just signs of God's direct intervention. So how should we think about this? Are the plagues direct intervention, or are they naturally determined signals of human impact on the environment? So I want to suggest an intermediate view, which highlights the way in which the plagues are also crucially responsive to Pharaoh's political decision-making. So actually the word oat, which is translated sign, is also used in later Jewish texts, and other Jewish texts of the time, as signs that people can do. So people can put phylacteries on their arms, and that's called a sign, or circumcision is considered to be a sign of the covenant, and those are actions which humans themselves take. So when we look in more detail at the plague story, what we find is that at each point, Pharaoh initially agrees to the demand that Moses and Aaron make, and the plague ceases. And then Pharaoh reneges on his agreement. And it's the reneging on the agreement that at almost every point triggers the plague. Okay? So it's actually Pharaoh who, through what he decides to do or not do, seems to actually act as the trigger of the plague. So even if God has set up a set of conditions, Pharaoh has agency within those conditions to determine a particular natural outcome. And in fact, ultimately, of course, his decision to let the Israelites go is his decision. So Exodus 12:31 says that. And there's actually an interesting sort of I won't say democratic moment, but a proto-populist moment where the text says, the Egyptians urged the people on, impatient to have them leave the country, for they said, we shall be dead, at Exodus 12:33. So even under the monarchical rule of Pharaoh, politics isn't just concentrated in his own hands. There's also a role for the Egyptians to kind of, through popular agency, kind of hurry things along. So what I want to say is that the relationship between God and nature in this story is mediated by human agency. It's not simply a picture that God determines nature, nor is nature just left on its own, but human decisions have a crucial role. So that brings me then to my third and final section, which is about the relationship between a people and their land. So this is something that we find again, especially in the Bible, but we'll see also in some Greek texts, which suggests that more broadly, not just in this unusual case of the plagues, but generally the flourishing of the land somehow reflects human ethical actions. And the interesting question is to figure out, what is that relationship exactly meant to be? So for the Israelites, in Deuteronomy, the land that is promised is originally described as a land flowing with milk and honey. And actually, it's interesting, it goes on, a land of wheat and barley, of vines, figs, and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey. So that all sounds sort of proto-Eden again, right? It sounds like there's all these kind of natural produce. But then at Deuteronomy 8, it goes on, a land whose rocks are iron and from whose hills you can mine copper. So clearly now we're already in the age of agriculture and metallurgy. This is not only going to be a land in which you just live off the fruit trees, but a land that is being given to you actually to exploit through metallurgy as well as agriculture. But then we get these very interesting discussions of, well, the relationship between how the land will flourish and what the people will do. So in Leviticus 26, God promises rain if the people follow the laws and commandments. And he says, the rain will make it possible for you to dwell securely in your land. That's Leviticus 26, 3-5. And the adverb securely is lavetach. And that adverb is used again at other points in Leviticus. Again, there's this question of, will the land flourish securely? And I find this very interesting because it seems to me it's a kind of proto-concern with sustainability again. It's not enough for the land to flourish in any given generation or given moment. The important thing is that it flourishes securely in a way that you can rely upon into the future. And so the image here so at Leviticus 26, God spells out that security would be respite from wild beasts and war. But if the people reject the commandments and spurn them and behave unethically, then God will withhold the rains to prevent the trees and the land from bearing food. Okay, so the thought is, well, the condition of the land. Now, again, it's interesting to think about. There are ways you might try to read that as a kind of proto-naturalistic count, right? If the people are engaged in civil strife, for example, then perhaps they themselves might damage their water systems, and then the water systems might not securely sustain them into the future. I think that's reading it a little bit. We're clearly meant to think that there's a significant role of divine agency, but I think that the idea that the land is somehow responsive to human ethical choices, ethical and political choices, I think still opens up a possibility for us perhaps to develop that line of thinking. And in particular, I think it reminds us that sustainability has a subjective as well as an objective dimension. So it relies on, we have to have justifiable confidence in the stability and security of a fertile land, in this case more broadly of the environment. We can see the same sort of image also in Leviticus 25 in the discussion of the Jubilee Year, which enjoins the Israelites to leave the lands fallow once every 7 years in order to, and in that 7th year, only to eat of its spontaneous produce. And that's actually in itself very interesting. So it's as if, the sabbatical. Yeah, 49, yeah, the Jubilee, the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year, right, in the 49th, absolutely. Thank you. Right, so, but in the sabbatical year, even already, the land is meant to be left fallow, and then in the Jubilee year, the sabbatical practice is combined with debt forgiveness, which is a further dimension of the Jubilee. And so again, there's a sense in which here God is saying, well, the people need to let the land rest, but if they don't let it rest through the sabbatical and Jubilee practices, then God will kind of force it to rest by laying waste to it, in a sense. So there's this sort of choice. Human agency can protect the land, or divine agency will sort of protect it by a kind of force majeure. And then very briefly, we can see a similar kind of theme also in the Greek text. So if we return again to Hesiod and to Plato, Hesiod in the Works and Days observes that those who observe justice will enjoy peace rather than war and feast on the crops they have tended, right? So again, the image is, if you are just, your agriculture will be stable, it will be protected, it will be reliable, and you'll be able to enjoy its fruits. If you're unjust, then either through divine punishment or natural consequences or both, you will suffer for those unjust actions. And finally then in Plato's Critias and in Athenian thought more broadly, we have the idea that there's a kind of special relationship between a given people and their given land. And the thought there is that the land itself somehow prompts the allocation of special sub-gods who can rule and teach the Athenian people. This is actually in the Menexenus, another further dialogue. And so what's interesting about that is the thought that is this language of the land itself prompts this ruling and teaching. There's something about the relationship between the people and the land in which the land can encourage us to live ethically and politically as we should. And in doing that, then we'll be able to maintain the ancient connection to the land, which a given people on this view have enjoyed. So let me conclude then. What I want to say is that, of course, today, theological conceptions of nature are much contested, but I think that these grand narratives of the human place in relation to nature, in the picture of this long history that we have of thinking about our relationship to the divine, whether it's domination or stewardship, whether it's creation or exodus, continues to play an important role in the cultural imagination. So I think when we listen to Stuart Brandon, we think it's only now in the last 50 years or 200 years that humans have become like gods. I think that lines us to the much more complex histories that we have of thinking about the ways gods operate and the nature of divine agency, human agency, and the condition of the natural world. And I've tried to suggest that even in cultures that have a much richer view of the regularity and the extent of divine agency, even there, they accommodate the idea that human agency has a powerful effect on the natural order, whether it be through the effects of our practices of agriculture, of deforestation, our immoralities that might undermine our water supplies, as I speculated, and so on. And so we've always been perhaps more powerful than we might have believed. We may have brought about as humans the fifth extinction, and that if we did, that was a political act as well as just a biological one. And we've always acted at least under or in partnership with gods, even if not always as gods. And I think that that power and the role of politics should give us pause as we seek to convert it into more ecologically conscious and conscientious forms. Thank you. Indicating, I'm sorry? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Absolutely. Yeah, so the question was that there's also an important edict in the Torah, which is that should there be a war once the Israelites have re-entered the land, the occupiers should not destroy fruit-bearing trees, so that protection of the fruit-bearing trees is to be respected, whatever politics might drive you to. That's, of course, right, and I think that is a very important dimension. So I only chose these three areas, but I agree that that's very important. And again, I'm sort of just intrigued with the role of fruit-bearing trees in all of this. I just find it so interesting that fruit-bearing trees are the kind of paradigm ultimate way in which the earth furnishes us with food, both for the Greeks and for the Hebrews, and that they have this special, they deserve this special protection kind of as a result of that. And I think it is because they somehow predate our practices of agriculture. There's a sense in which, of course, people learn to graft them and to, tend them in different ways, to prune them, but there's a sense in which, it's not that we discovered how to make fruit-bearing trees. That was what the earth was furnished with before we came along, and we have to protect them, as you say. So thank you. Yeah. 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 Yeah, thank you. So the question was that I called the idol of the pre-political period of abundance, of fantasy, and Bob Cohen was suggesting, is it perhaps rather a cultural memory of the hunter-gatherer era in which there was much lower population density, there was less warfare, and there was, in a sense, a reliable sort of supply of food. I think there's something right about the idea that abundance, might be possible, that might be part of this. But the reason I think that these particular visions are still in the realm of the fantastic is, again, they actually are all fruitarian, right? So they leave out hunting and meat. And I think that's actually, Peter will appreciate this, I think that's actually a really interesting part of it, and I think it is part of this idea that, well, there was no conflict at all. There was no violence not even hunting. So again, the sort of fair not view is that once you have hunting, you have sacrifice, you have, that's all. I think they are aware that that's all in a way part of a certain kind of cultural economy. So it might be true that hunter-gatherers have less warfare, but they still have some warfare, and they still have violence, they still have and so I think it's interesting that these fantasies kind of ratchet it up even one more step, and that's why I stress the fruitarian dimension of them so much. But having said that, there may still be something in that idea, and I certainly, Hesiod's account, I'm only talking about, he has 5 ages in this story that he tells in Works and Days, and I'm only talking about this kind of earliest one. And then there are sort of successive stages at which you get agriculture, hunting, and metallurgy, and so on. And so I think they're aware that there are sort of levels of sort of technological and economic and political development that they're already aware of, having seen in their own time. And similarly, the Greeks are very aware of what the Egyptians have done in terms of managing the flooding of the Nile along its banks and things like that. So thank you. I think there's something right about that, but the fantasy is even more extreme. Yeah. 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 That's a good point. I don't have the full Hebrew text with me, actually. So that's a good point. Although I think you're right that we should say something about seed bearing. I'm not sure that what we have to say about seed bearing. So just to repeat the question, Bill's suggestion was that it points towards labor already, even in the first biblical creation story. I'm not sure that has to be true. It could be that the emphasis on seeds is, again, the emphasis on the spontaneous regeneration. So anything that has a seed can regenerate itself kind of automatically. And I think the fact that there's so much explicit emphasis put on labor only entering the picture, after the eating from the tree of knowledge, to me militates against that a little bit. But I agree that it's important, and I shouldn't overgeneralize that it's just about fruit. It is an important detail. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm. Mm. Yeah. 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 Right. Thank you so much. Did people hear that, or should I repeat it? It was I'll just briefly repeat it. That was a really interesting point. So the thought was the ancient texts kind of help themselves to the idea that one people, one land, or a people, a land anyway. And so that the people can expect that if they care for the land, it's their own descendants that will benefit from that. So they're sort of within a delimited scope, their actions, will affect themselves in some sense and their descendants. Whereas today we don't have quite that image. Maybe even already with the New World, we lose that sort of boundedness. I think that's actually a really interesting point, and it's of course, what all the emphasis on the pictures of the Earth from space and all of that is trying to counter. So I think I've actually always been very struck that in Shakespeare, there's so much imagery of the earth as a globe, and that we can, I think it's Shakespeare's era, coming at the tail end of kind of the age of exploration and encounter, is I think very much kind of like the version of that for him. That image is very much what we have with this images from space, that already being aware of this kind of one bounded entity. But of course, the interactions become much more complex, and the cultural norms are much more diverse, and it's much more difficult to manage this kind of system in that setting. I think that's a very good point. I think that's really true. I was just going to comment, you started by saying something about what you do has effects on the future, and the fruit trees point reminded me also, I think there's another command in the Torah that if a war breaks out and you're in the middle of, or maybe it's in the Talmud, if a war breaks out and you're in the middle of planting a tree, you should finish planting the tree and then you should go to war, which is kind of an interesting, I don't know if anyone knows the source of that. Yeah. Right. Right, maybe. That's it. That's right. That's right. Right. That's right. Thank you so much. Yes, I was conflating those two in my mind. That's great. Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. Great. Susan has a question back there. Yeah. 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 Yeah, thank you so much. So one way, and this is part of the mess. Okay, so the question was, how can this wisdom that I've tried to distill from the ancient texts, how can that be used today? And Susan Bryson was pointing out that, we do get people today, fundamentalists of various kinds, saying, God is punishing us this way or that way, which seems like this crude picture that I was trying to argue against. And I think one is very much one of the lessons of the Nexus course, and a lesson that Bob Cohane is always giving us in various ways. But one of the reasons I focus so much on politics here is that I do think that politics is the kind of under-articulated key dimension of our current predicament, right? So it may be true that, there are these Anthropocene level forces that we've unleashed, in terms of our distributed actions and, the sort of knock-on natural consequences that they set going. But really the action here is at the level of politics. Like, we have it within our scope to do something to control some of that, maybe not all of it. And that really is politics. It's, in a way we know the scientific story. It's politics, and politics informed by the human imagination, so by ethics and the arts, that really in a way has to be now in the seat of the human response and where the action lies. So that's what I was trying to say, that, I think the thing with the Lynn White kind of story is that made it sound like, oh, our thought about nature and the world and the gods and so forth, has just gone so wrong that until we completely remake all our theological understandings and our mythologies, we just can't solve that at all. And I wanted to say, no, but if it's a problem of our democratic culture, then our democratic culture is something that is more within our control. Again, maybe not perfectly. Like, I love the Greek gods image, because I do think it's important to say, something can have been within your control once, but you can't necessarily control or reverse its consequences, right? So sometimes the Anthropocene can seem to make us too inflated in our agency, right? We brought this about, but now, so I think really it would be the lesson of the importance of politics at this kind of much more local level of human agency that I would want to, conscious human agency, that I would want to stress. Mm-hmm. Just one more. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. So that's a good question. So the question was, colonialism has subsumed or undermined many other cultural traditions of other peoples, and in particular, two of the ones the two that I was focusing on, the ancient Greek and the biblical, have achieved, I'm putting this word into your mouth here, a kind of hegemony in a way. And so how can I be sure that my conclusions hold more broadly? I think that's a really important point. I mean, these are the traditions that I know something about, so that's why I focused on them. But I think it's a very important point that there are much richer and other cultural traditions that may also have this view. From the little that I've read and been able to understand, of some others, I think that my sense is that there is a story to be told at this level, but it would need to be told in more detail. And that was why I made the point about the ancient Chinese contrast, because I was really taken aback when I heard that talk. I was so used to people kind of making nice with the stewardship language, and there's been a lot of, in some ways very effective and productive appropriation of that language in contemporary political movements that have tried to harness churches, in particular, and to some extent synagogues and mosques and others, to climate politics action. So I was sort of used to thinking, yes, that's a good positive language. And so then to hear this contrast with, no, that's part of the problem. The Taoist Wu Wei is a much more powerful alternative. That sort of drew me up short in the way of that kind of challenge. So I absolutely take that point, and I think this should only be a modest contribution to that conversation, but certainly shouldn't forestall it or predict what its outcomes might be. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. So the question was, I said more about how biological agency interacts with political agency kind of in antiquity, but how does current geological agency, the Anthropocene level of agency, interact with political agency? I do think this is actually really hard. I mean, because I think that there is this tension between, and many people have pointed this out, that one of the things about the Anthropocene language is it can make it sound like we're all doing this, we're all equally doing it, but of course, actually the contribution to climate change in particular is very unevenly distributed among rich and poor in terms of the extent to which they're contributing to it. The effects, of course, but if we're just talking about the agency, leaving aside the effects. So I think it's actually very hard to think about how political agency intersects with geological agency. I mean, of course, Paris, is one great model of how to do that, where at least there's some idea of, what was the whole world, almost signing up, and is still much of the world being signed up to a political project that can seem, but even then, I think one of the challenges there, and this is something we've talked about a lot in the Climate Futures Initiative, is that the temporal, so that gives us kind of a spatial match. We get, the Anthropocene as operating at the level of the globe, and then we get, let's say Paris as operating almost at the level of the globe. But what you don't have there is the temporal match, right? Because the geological agency is agency over this incredibly long time horizon with effects stretching so far into the future. And it's hard to see how any political agency is going to be able to kind of match those effects. And there's been these interesting studies of the efforts to bury nuclear waste and how human cultures can think about what it means to bury nuclear waste on such a long time horizon when we have no idea what the politics or the language or anything of these future cultures is going to, or our future culture is going to be. So I think that's actually, I hadn't really quite articulated that before, but I think that's the challenge, is really at the level of the time horizon. And I am there are some political efforts to do that. So there's the Long Now Foundation in California, which is trying to come up with clocks that operate on, say, a 10,000 year or 100,000 year time frame, so that we just have the idea that we're operating in a world, like our political agency is sort of governed by clocks and calendars. And so if we had clocks and calendars that put us in a different time horizon, that might help. So those are just a few of the ideas, but I think that really is the major challenge. That's a good way of articulating it. Thank you.